Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussion only. No endorsements by Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed. Hi, welcome to Writers in Focus. I'm your host, James Taylor, and today I'm delighted to have once again on Writers in Focus my dear friend, Jessica Handler.
James.
May I call you Jessica?
You may.
Welcome to the Atlanta Fulton Public Library and the Fulton County Government Center.
Thank you.
5 years ago, we talked about your wonderful memoir, Invisible Sisters. We're here now to talk about your latest book. It's called Braving the Fire, A Guide to Writing About Grief and Loss. Yeah. By way of introduction, Jessica was 8 years old when her younger sister, Susie, was diagnosed with leukemia. Her youngest sister, Sarah, was born with a rare fatal blood disease, Kosman syndrome. Right. Both sisters died at a very young age. Her parents' marriage fell apart. Her father, a very prominent civil rights attorney right here in Atlanta, broke up with her mother, dissolved the marriage, and died of cancer. Your mother passed away during the completion of this book. We're here to talk about grief and writing about grief, and you have been in the fire, haven't you?
Yeah, I have.
Before we embark on this, and you conduct workshops all around America. In fact, you just flew back from Chicago last night.
Yeah.
Let's let the audience know what you mean by grief and what can be done about it. I mean, does writing about grief really help?
You know, it depends on the person. Various people have different art forms. If you're a dancer or a painter, then maybe you don't want to write about grief. But I've found that in my experience and in the sort of limited lay science reading I've been doing, that we want to tell our stories and we want to understand, and I certainly wanted to understand, who am I now? You know, after these things have happened, after these things have changed me. And I'm always really careful when I read from the book or when I lead a workshop that grief, certainly death and dying are the heavy hitters, if you will. But grief is anything that changes your narrative. It's disability, it's the war experience, it's being a refugee.
Loss.
Loss.
You go to the Oxford Dictionary of Proverbs of Macmillan, and from the ancient Egyptians, Romans, Greeks, Chinese, loss is a part of life.
Loss is a part of life.
Grief. Every great culture has a word for grief.
Yeah, and every language and every great culture. And one of the things I came across in my own life and in writing this is grief, significant grief or loss is not just over. You don't just look around one day and say, well, that's done.
No,
you know, you're changed. You keep going until such time as you don't, but you're changed. So how do you live your life and know who you are now?
We ran into a party a couple of, less than a year ago, and I mentioned that a friend of mine had died. Mm-hmm. And I can take this objectively. Yeah. And I said, but there'd be times I'd be driving around Atlanta and see a tree or hear a song, and I'd break into tears.
Oh, songs,
what's going on with me?
Yeah.
And but I want you to talk about this wonderful, wonderful book. It's not just a treatise for writers about dealing with grief. It's about writing in general, too.
Yes.
But you focus on grief.
Yeah.
We understand what grief is, the loss. Your book, the way I have read it, is about the redemptive and transformative power of writing about one's grief.
Yeah.
It changes the world.
Yeah.
You use the structure of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. Can we talk? Let's use those, okay? Yeah. My stages were anger, denial, and denial.
I know. When I talk about this, I tell people, and I really firmly believe this, you know, the 5 stages of grief, the book on death and dying came out in 1969, and it was really the first book about this as a concept.
Right.
And it was written initially about the dying, you know.
Right.
And then
for the
dying, yeah. And it came out of a series of studies that she did. And over the course of time, Dr. Kubler-Ross changed her mind about it, had other books related to it. And I really feel firmly that I don't have great loyalty to the 5 stages as they stand. But like you, I have not spent a lot of time in denial But I've spent a lot of time in anger.
Right.
A fair amount of time when I was a kid in bargaining. You know, if my sister was in the hospital and we shared a bedroom, it's like, okay, if I don't throw my coat on her bed, maybe she'll come home a day earlier. So that's bargaining. And, you know, it's funny, Teresa Weaver in Atlanta Magazine, when she reviewed this book, said it was also a guide to life.
Yeah.
And I was so pleased to see that.
So
it's true.
Let's keep that in mind. I want the audience to understand we're not talking about writing about grief and how it will make everything better.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Each chapter is designed to help you put words on paper.
Yes.
By accessing beliefs and sentiments and experiences.
Right.
You use the examples of other great writers, Nick Flynn, Natasha Trethewey,
Abby
Janice
Thomas.
Ray, John Didion.
Yeah.
So let's use these 5 stages of grief, and
Yeah.
you add one, which is my favorite, of course,
Thank
is
you.
renewal.
Renewal, yes.
So, denial.
Yeah.
Something horrible has happened in one's life. You experience a hole in your life. The Romans had these great expressions for it, the Stoics and stuff like that. But I am so angry at life, and I'm dying, and I'm depressed, and like, what am I get? That's
Denial,
what are you going to do? What are you going to do? I mean, let's start with denial.
Sure. Well, using the 5 stages.
Okay, let's
of
start
grief,
the interview with that.
There you go. Using the 5 stages of grief, you know, you start
Thank
with
you.
denial, and you're not denying that this thing has happened,
Right,
but you're
right.
denying potentially, do I have the right to write this story? What do I have to say that is different from someone else who's lost someone to cancer? Or maybe it was a public event and you say, oh, you know, the newspapers covered it plenty. What could I possibly add? And yet you have this gnawing need to write about it. Or you deny, oh, I'm not a professional writer. I couldn't possibly do this.
Right.
Well, if you're just writing the story down so that you get a sense of narrative, so that you understand what happened, your story, and I'm using sort of the grand you, but if you're denying your right to write because the newspapers wrote about it or because Joan Didion wrote so beautifully about losing her husband, your story is your story. Write what you know. Write what you believe. Write your version of it. And every chapter has exercises at the end.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the exercises in the denial chapter is little questions that you can answer for yourself or to your lost loved one or your loved place or who you were before. One of my favorite ones is to write a letter to that person, including yourself, or place. You would be happy to know that if I were to write it to my mother, I would say, you'd be happy to know that I finally cut my hair. So, you know, it's a sense of putting yourself in the world now, and it's also a sense of understanding that you have moved on in a way, and that you own your life. You know, this is my take on the story. It's owning that. So.
What you do this for a living, Jessica. You address groups around the country. You teach writing for a living. Do you? And I've often thought about this. Like, I'm sure you've encountered really talented students who come up to you and say, you know, Miss Handler, why should I write anything? I'm talented. I can write it, but you know, as the preacher says, all is vanity and vexation of the spirit. What do I have to say? And that's what I take away from this chapter is that it helps, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And I'm never going to tell someone they have to write. James, you have to go write your story. But if you've come to a workshop or you've come up to me at a reading and say, what do I have to write? Clearly this idea has already begun germinating in your mind.
Yeah.
So write what you want to write.
Write 1 sentence, write 2 sentences.
Yeah, there's an exercise in here that says, send yourself an email every day just with 1 sentence in it. So if you say, oh, I don't have time to write, you know, who does? But if you're at work and you get an idea, just jot yourself a quick email. The name of that kid who shot up my light with a BB gun was so-and-so. Or you remember that time when Dad did such and such. And these accumulate and you've started to write. It's not a grand live in a garret kind of thing.
This is where you introduce the concept, and I'm not familiar with it. I think I know what it means, but look for these brain sparks.
I made that up.
Oh, what's a brain spark? It's wonderful.
Well, the image goes with fire. Fire, ignition.
Yeah.
A brain spark, here's one for me.
I love it.
I was writing the first book, when I was writing Invisible Sisters, I was driving to work one day, and I had a job, you know, a corporate job, and I was driving to work one day and was listening to the radio. And an old Eddie Money song came on the radio, 2 Tickets to Paradise. Which now he's doing ads with like a what do you call it, travel agent.
Yeah.
But once upon a time, my sister Sarah and I, as teenagers, made up joke lyrics. All kids make up joke lyrics. So I'm driving along singing, and those joke lyrics start coming out of my mouth. I'm driving along to work and I'm singing our joke lyrics. and then I start to cry because I miss my sister and the lyrics were stupid, and that's a brain spark because that became a scene or put me in an emotional space. If you sit down to write and say, did we ever make up any funny lyrics? You're not going to go anywhere. Yeah. But if something just occurs to you randomly, that's where the story comes from.
It's funny how grief is always associated with fire in the biblical sense and in a classical pagan sense.
Yeah.
It's a redeeming. You lose, and yet the fire cleanses you.
Atlanta and the Phoenix.
Yeah, I mean, we can go on and on, but we're here to talk about this fantastic book, Braving the Fire. The second chapter, the second phase, call it, of Kubler-Ross's 5 stages is anger. Yeah. Perhaps one of my favorite chapters, in the sense that if I were to write a book about what I've experienced in life, you'd say, don't point fingers. Don't unless you're writing a novel where you want a villain or something. The villains will show themselves in real life. Could you explain that?
Sure.
Yeah.
And,
I love that, what you say.
It's funny that we were talking about it. I did a workshop yesterday also at the Gildas Club in Chicago. And we were talking about, you've got a protagonist and an antagonist. Yeah. Your antagonist could be a person who hurt you in some way. What if your antagonist is a natural disaster? What if it's Hurricane Katrina? What if your antagonist is a rogue cell? What if your antagonist is a decision in a corporate boardroom that has lost you your career? It's not a person. But still, if you write, so you've got to find a way to present that. But if you just write out of anger, inventing your spleen, which is kind of a weird image.
Sure.
It's not a fully developed story. You can be angry all you want and write that in your journal or talk to your friends about it. But in a story, and I use the word story for nonfiction as well, in a narrative, no well-written character is 100% good, 100% bad. So maybe that physician, let's just use a medical instance, had a bad bedside manner. They were a clumsy person, they were short-tempered, they were rude. You didn't like them personally. That doesn't mean they're a bad person. It just means that in that interaction, perhaps they didn't have those skills. Or a character who might, this is a true story about somebody who, when I told them that I'd been away from work because my sister had died and I'd taken a leave. Oh, the hamster. God. Yeah. He said, I know how
Can I tell that story?
Feel free.
Jessica walks into her office and says, my sister just died. And the guy says, I know what that's like. I had a hamster who died one time.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Is that...
Well, there's a part of me that just, you're just stunned. It's like, how could you say that?
But he didn't mean it.
He didn't mean it to equate loss of a sister with loss of a hamster.
Still a rotten
or
thing.
Perhaps he truly loved his hamster. But what that is a person who is uncomfortable talking about grief, as many of us are. So, of course, I was angry at the time, and I'm still kind of baffled. But at the same time, you've got to give that character a little room and say, I don't know how this guy was raised. I don't know how uncomfortable he is with an admission like that. So that creates a more full character. The same way, you and I like ourselves reasonably well, I think, except for that time when we did that thing.
That's what I'm
So when I tell people
that's
to write,
so funny.
When we write about grief, do you have someone in your life who talks about everything but? Or how people fidget when you want to change the topic, or overcompensate by talking about happy stuff, or creates scene again?
When I read Invisible Sisters, your fantastic memoir 5 years ago, your father appeared to be, taking a lot of drugs and having affairs and remarrying and even abandoning his wife and the girls. And when
he moved away. He got a job out of the country.
But when I read Braving the Fire, you still love your father. I mean, it's like in Angela's Ashes, Frank McCourt never says my father was a bastard.
Yeah.
But in all the reviews, he said, "Oh, what a horrible father! Drank up the paycheck, treated the kids like hell in Ireland." And but when you read the book, he never says my father was a villain.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying in this chapter.
Well, also that goes to scene and summary. Do you want to come out and say, this person was this way, the end? Or do you want to show this person in action with other people so that you as a reader get a sense of their positives, their negatives, how other people react to them?
So you're saying in this chapter, when someone is writing about their grief, and it could be a diary, it could be the beginning of a memoir, it could be the start of a novel, an essay, don't point fingers in many ways. Am I taking...
Well, yeah, I mean, you can in your draft, certainly, but...
And you say this in the book. There were exercises.
There are exercises about how to figure out the depth of a character, because you can point fingers, you can be very, very angry at somebody. I'm not going to deny the existence of anger, especially in a condition of assault or something like that. I don't want to tell people to, forgive this person unilaterally. But at the same time, if you write a memoir, essay, novel, whatever, in which this bad character is all bad, the end, I hate him, I, as a reader, don't have an opportunity to engage with that character the way the protagonist does and get a sense of it. So that's kind of what that is from a craft sense. And you're right in talking about my dad. Sure, bad things, good things.
Can we talk about your dad in that photograph? Because the next chapter is on
bargaining.
Bargaining. And the bargaining is, what shall I use? I mean, if I were to think about the death of my mother or the death of my best friend a couple of years ago, what elements do I use? You bargain about, am I taking...
Research, content, form,
right.
shape. Do I want this to be a chronological story? Do I want it to include letters or pictures? Maybe I'm also a poet and I want little sections of poetry. So somebody the other day talked about the tyranny of chronology.
I love that expression.
I know. I think I...
What does it mean?
It means, the way I'm taking it away, is that if you feel that my story must cover A through Z, in A through Z order, and include all the letters of the alphabet or all the contents of my life, what does that serve in terms of the story? So bargaining is about what I put in, what I leave out, why.
And you leave out stuff. I mean, you're Jessica, you're honest in this book. You say that when you were preparing Invisible Sisters and even this book, Braving the Fire, there are stuff from your sisters' lives that you don't even want to see anymore. Is that true?
I use this example a lot. There's a reel-to-reel tape.
I was going to say memorabilia.
I should do it this way.
Yeah.
There's a reel-to-reel tape that I have from probably 1964 of three little girls playing. And it's probably, from somebody's yard or something. And I can play back a reel-to-reel tape. I have access to the technology. I don't want to hear it. I know I have it, and I also know that in writing about the tough stuff, which is kind of the cipher term I use, in writing about the tough stuff, we have to understand where we can go and where we can't emotionally. What is braving the fire you can put your hand in and pull it out, and what can you put your hand in and know you're really going to get hurt? And so, for example, in this reel-to-reel tape of my sisters and I playing, I'm not going to get rid of it. I want to have it, but I know that setting it up to listen to it or having it transferred to an MP4, it's going to be too hard for me to listen.
In this chapter,
everyone has their version of that.
But you used, and I've got this strange smile on my face because I heard you speak at a writers group, and you talked about the decision you used to address a photograph that you saw of your father.
Yeah.
That story itself could be the beginning of a novel. Can I set you up?
Please,
okay.
feel free.
You and your wonderful husband Mickey go to Memphis, ostensibly to visit Graceland.
Yeah.
But of course, if you're in Memphis, you've got to see the Civil Rights Museum.
Right.
Your father was a great civil rights attorney here in Atlanta. Helped out a lot. Friends of Martin Luther King. Take it from there.
All right. So I wrote about this in the book,
and
I read from this when I'm doing readings. So my husband and I are getting ready to leave Memphis, and we're at a diner having breakfast and getting ready to go, and the National Civil Rights Museum is across the road.
You've got to see it. You have to see it.
Yeah, of course. And my husband says we should go see it, and I was thinking, we should. But, there's nothing here I didn't learn at my father's knee or see firsthand. And
your father took you to the MLK's funeral.
Right. And that's another really important story. But, I want to see the balcony at the Lorraine Motel. I need to see this, but I don't really want to do it. But we end up doing it. So we're going to the museum. It's an important museum, really valuable experience. And as we're leaving, we're going down a walkway, and there's a photo exhibit, sort of the thank you for visiting exhibit. And it's documentary photographs of Memphis that weekend, April 4th, 5th, 1968. And as we're leaving, I come face to face with a photograph of my father and another man they're sitting on the curb, and they just look beat and miserable, understandably. And my father's holding a placard that says Honor King, End Racism, which I've had. I remember him bringing it to me that weekend. It's folded in half because he had folded it to put it in the overhead bin on Piedmont Airlines. And that has hung in my dorm room. It hangs in my hallway. But there is my 32-year-old father.
Wow.
And I didn't know the photo existed. And my father, who had died maybe 6 months before, didn't know the photo existed.
And
I would have heard about
the administration of the museum didn't know who that man was.
Photo,
but it was such a photo, right?
Yeah, the cut line on the photo said unidentified men. So I screamed and started to cry. And, you know, you don't cry in museums, and not like that. And a guard came up, and I asked him to take me to an administrator, and I explained to her what had happened. She ultimately put me in touch with a photographer, a terrific guy named Benedict Fernandez, who had done a series of photographs, and this was from a book called Countdown to Eternity. I talked to Ben. I told him who the people, well, who my dad was. I don't know who the other guy was. I forget his name. And it hasn't been fixed in the book because the book is an excellent thing. But now Ben knows who it was. So.
And you decided to incorporate that in
the story of this because it's
right.
Partly because I believe in using elements of my own life in talking about memoir, but also when we write memoir, we have ephemera, we have photos, we have letters, we have this, we have that. What do you do with this? How do you make a story out of that other than here's a picture of my dad? So
I love talking about this book, and I just want the audience to realize that Jessica uses the examples of other great writers who have written memoirs. You've called them up. Hey, hey, Mr. Nick Flynn. Hey, Natasha Trethewey, Mrs. Poet Laureate of the United States. So how do you deal with loss? And then you include your own. There's a little chapter that's every chapter has
my story.
Your vignettes.
Yeah.
Moving on to the fourth stage, depression is the one that I know best, but. You're not a psychiatrist.
No.
And you say in this book that when you are dealing with the depression over grief, over a great loss, you run the risk of encountering it once more.
Yeah.
In other words, you have violated that thing that your mother once told you a million times. Time will cure everything. My mother used to say that. Time will, you know. But it doesn't. But as you get older, it doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, my father's in his 90s and he's still upset about losses in his life. You know?
Yeah, I'm still a little annoyed about the hamster guy.
Here we are laughing about grief, but we have to.
Well, you have to, and there's a section here about humor,
that's
too.
That's part about that, yeah.
It was really important to me that I talk in this book about self-care during depression. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a physician. I don't claim to be one. But I talked with a physician, I talked with a psychiatrist, I talked with various people about just general things about taking care of yourself when you feel that you've bottomed out. And depression, to me, I can't really address it in this book from a DSM, a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual perspective, but I can tell you depression is bottoming out, stasis. You know, you get to a point where you're just like, oh, I can't do this anymore. So does that mean you go back to the table, to the notepad or the computer and force yourself to write? No, maybe you don't. Maybe you take a walk. Maybe you eat healthy. If you are running the risk of emotional or physical self-injury, do something else. Go see your friends. I volunteered. This was the first book, Invisible Sisters. I was working on it right about during Hurricane Katrina. And, you know, a lot of people came to Atlanta as, you know, left New Orleans for a while. So I volunteered with an organization here to feed and house and clothe people who were temporarily adrift.
That's a great chapter, too.
So, and I did it partly because I believe in Tikkun Olam and helping others, and also because I'm miserable and sad at my desk back in my own life, in my history. There's people who need help right now, so turn off the computer and get out of it for a while. Very important.
The last, you add renewal, which I love, which is just the notion of once you've written a memoir and once you've at least gotten something down, it could be as one sentence, it could be 30,000 sentences. There's this notion of renewal. But before we conclude this interview, I have to ask you because when I was in college, a friend of mine wrote a poem called The Luxury of Grief. And it's stuck in my head. The Romans had this expression, and the Stoics used to say, grief, bloody luxury. You know, like life goes on.
Sure.
I know that. So if you're conducting a workshop in writing about grief, does it really work? Has it worked for you, my sister?
When you say,
I'm not trying to gut your question, but you have spent years writing about grief.
Yeah. I write about other things too.
I know. I know. But does it work?
When you say work, what is work? When you say
I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess has your life gotten easier?
Yeah.
That's my question.
What this does
That's
for
a big question.
Yeah,
I don't know how to ask it.
Yeah, and you asked me earlier what's grief, and I said I don't know.
Right.
You know.
No, wait a second. On page 188, you say grief. It's large and shape-shifting.
It is large and shape-shifting.
You don't know.
Yeah. It works in a way that if we know that there's no closure, you know, we can't say, well, that's done. To me, if you're so overwhelmed by grief or loss, and if you imagine it as sort of a big file cabinet in front of you that you can't get around, maybe writing about it or creating some kind of narrative art about it at least allows you to take that blockage, maybe move it aside a little bit so you can go forward with the life that you're in now. One of the first exercises I do with writers in workshops is I have them write a little bit about who are you now today, this week, not last week or last month or 20 years ago. Who are you right now? And it kind of